So I wanted to share the historical background. So giving everyone a bigger picture of where Daniel falls in the history of Israel, I'm sorry. So just wanted to kind of give everyone, I'll try to make it a 1 minute review. God calls Abraham. Abram leaves his father, and then he has his son Isaac and then Jacob. And Jacob becomes Israel and has 12 tribes. They are living in Egypt. And then for the time when Pharaoh, who knew about Joseph had died, he started to oppress and use the Israelites as slaves, and they were under the captivity of Egypt for 400 years. God calls out, Moses brought in, Moses brings out the people to the promised land. Joshua continues on and enters into the promised land because Moses wasn't able to go into the promised land. And then there's an era of what we call the judges. So they're not kings, but they are the ones who, what the way that I share it is, carries the role of both the priest and the king together. They are more than a tribe leader, but they're significant. So there's, I believe, 13 judges at that time until the Israelites say, we need a king. So the first king is, as you know, Saul became the first king of Israel. However, God had chosen David. So David comes in and he becomes the second king of Israel and succeeds his kingdom to Solomon. However, in Solomon, there are fight against the brothers, and then the two kingdoms are divided. So what we call northern Israel and then the southern Judea. Northern Israel would be around 10 tribes. Southern Judea, they just call Judea, will be 2 tribes. And that is really more of where David comes from and the Benjamin. So those are the 2 and then the other 10. Throughout this entire history, it starts with Abram saying, and God saying, Abram, I am your God and you are mine. So you have to keep this covenant. And throughout this whole kingdom and throughout the whole time of these divided kingdoms, God had sent prophets saying that you have to turn away from your sins and live according to my ways. And if you don't, that's where it kept on coming and saying, then because you didn't listen to me and you have been not faithful to my covenant, there is going to be some kind of fall. And that's where the temple all crumbles down and they are brought into 70 years of Babylon captivity. It's a 2 minute. I hope I did it well. It's just a recap of where that is. So that's the big picture. So Daniel comes in the time where they are here in Babylon. So I'm going to go on, talk about a couple of things. First, chapter 1, and I'm going to read verse 1 to 2. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judea, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judea, into his hands with some of the articles of the temple of God. These had carried off in the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure's house of his God. And that's Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 to 2. Now, I do have to say, this happens quite often, but like I said, this is like an expansion of my sermon preparation. I do have to say, in my sermon, I did say from 2 Kings chapter 24, it is verse 12 and 14, where it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar brought all the people with gifts and all the people with soldiers, craftsmen, and artisans, around 10,000 of them. But I told you, everyone, that this is where Daniel was captive to Babylon. And I have to correct myself because I was trying to make sure that I go back and look into this again. And I noticed that the king that appears when Daniel is brought to Babylon is Jehoiakim, ends with a K-I-M. The king that I referenced in 2 Kings chapter 24 was Jehoiachin. So what we know is Nebuchadnezzar actually invaded Israel twice. So he first went, Jehoiakim was the one, and then he withdrew, not because he lost, but because he had control over there. And then he withdrew and came back again, and that's when Jehoiachin was a king. And actually, that time he took Jehoiachin back to Babylon as well. So the way that we can make harmony of this discrepancy is that in the first invasion, Nebuchadnezzar should have brought these royal families back. It may not have been included in the artsmen and craftsmen. So I have to say, I think I jumped the gun. I was looking at it and I'm trying to figure out, oh, I made a mistake. And that's the way that I am resolving my mistake, because it comes from Jeremiah chapter 25. And it says, it's 25 verse 9, I will summon all the people of the Northlands, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord, and I will bring them against the land, its inhabitants, and against all the surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror, scorn, and everlasting ruin. Now, why am I talking about Jeremiah? Jeremiah in chapter 25 is a reference of when Nebuchadnezzar first invades Judea. And God is using Jeremiah to say, hey, because of the unfaithfulness of the covenant, I am raising up Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and he's going to invade and he's going to bring he's going to ruin the city and the kingdom, and he's going to bring the people back. That's the part where I am trying to talk about where Daniel might have come back. There's just one more verse that I'm going to read. Is from Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is another prophet. And this is all in the handout that I shared with everyone. If you haven't received it, please let me know. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that rootless and impetuous people who swept across the whole earth to seize dwelling not their own. And in these prophets and in these statements, what we are seeing that how the Israel has been destroyed and how the Babylon at that time, who became a superpower, were all done in the sovereignty of God. So that's the historical background. I hope some of them make sense. If you have any questions, this is the point where I'm going to pause. I want to ask and try to attempt to answer any questions that may have arise from from my explanations. Now, was this good background information just to kind of situate us, right? Good. I'm glad to hear that. Then let me go and share a picture really quick and see if I can do this. I'm using my iPad and it really doesn't work that well, but let's try my best. Okay, here is a map of the time when Babylon Empire had arisen. And if you see, Judea is right next to the Mediterranean Sea, and you will definitely know where that is. And of course, it is adjacent to Egypt. And Babylon is actually, if you go toward your right-hand side, you will see Babylon right next to Nippur, or the larger capitalized will be Elam. Now, the route that is from Jerusalem, Damascus, Tadmor, the Euphrates River, and to Babylon had been the route that the captives of Israel had used to be sent to Babylon, because they weren't able to cross the desert. So what I'm trying to point out is that this was quite of a brutal journey. And even though they haven't gone through the desert, they have gone through a long line of people just being exiled from their hometowns, seeing the destruction and the death of all their loved ones, and especially the pride of the nation, which we see as the temple now being raided by this king. And they are now sent onto the city called Babylon. And that's where I talk about that sudden shift in status. And especially if you are Daniel, and as we see in the Bible, that he was raised in a royal family. And he had to go through this entire journey on foot. And the time that he is here, I really have to say, there might not have been great appetite to really comply to the orders of the king, right? Don't we see a lot of rebellion? I mean, that could have happened. He could have rebelled against the king. Now, the rebellion and the result would be very simple, death, but he doesn't have to. But he complied to the king because he also held on to the hope. So the hope that Daniel, I'm making a connection that Daniel held on to, when God was sharing about the destruction of Jerusalem, God always coupled it with the hope of rebuilding Jerusalem. So it wasn't, I'm going to punish you, y'all going to be exiled, and that's it. I'm not going to be your God anymore. It was always coupled with the hope that there is going to be a new line of kingdom that is going to sprout out from what we call the stump of Jesse. So in a way, I do believe that might have been the reason. That might have been one of the reasons. I don't want to kind of make it the only reason. I know one of the reasons why Daniel said, okay, even in Babylon, even I am captive, even though I'm just a slave now, I still need to be resolved. I need to hold on to that hope. I need to do my best, which I have to say it shows a good parallel with the story of Joseph. Right? Remember the story of Joseph where he was kind of raised as the favored child, and now he is a slave. And in the midst of that, Joseph still said, I am going to hold on to God who is with me. Now, I want to pause, just if anyone wants to chime in, this is the time. If not, we're going to go on to the king's food. No, I just want to make sure, if are these information helping? Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
yes or no?
That was great.
It was good.
Thank you.
I like that.
Okay, now, okay, good. Now I'm going to go onto the king's food. Why in the world did Daniel and his 3 friends not eat the king's food? I wanted to, in the handout that I gave you, I said 3 possibilities. But I wanted to hear from you. What was your, like, how were you taught of why Daniel and his 3 friends did not eat the king's food? And anyone unmute and just tell us why?
Well, they grew up, this was what it was. And probably they hadn't been shown anything that doing otherwise would be more beneficial.
So that probably one of the way that the tradition that their dietary tradition may not have been compliant with what the king food was offering. So that's one thing. I actually put it as not compliant to the law. So that Nancy, that's what you may have been saying. Anybody else?
They may not have been curious. If they weren't food buffs, if they weren't foodies, then the idea of eating meat with different spices, for example, or vegetables with different spices, that would they would have sniffed it and said, I don't think so.
It's a different palate, right? Because they're in a different country, different palate, different spices.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I kind of remember being taught that with every new ruler would come new rules, and Daniel and the 3 were sticking to the, I'll say like previous Jewish eating rules, if that
Yeah,
makes sense, like
yeah.
the ones lined up in, is it Leviticus, where they talk about like what's clean and considered
Yes.
unclean?
Yes.
So they didn't want to adopt or assimilate the new rule. I don't know if it's new and how historically accurate my verbiage of this is. Like they
New
did,
cultural rule. So
right, did not want to assimilate to these new
Yeah.
rules of eating. They wanted to stick with, no, this is what we were taught, and this,
Mhm.
and we were taught that the food that they're serving is unclean, and we
Mhm.
should, eat this because we were taught not to,
Yes,
that's
not
against
to
us,
do
it's
it.
against our religious beliefs.
Exactly. And then the word that the Bible uses, defile ourselves. So defile ourselves because it may have different. So these are all, what we can say is it's all speculations. Now when I say speculations, because we don't really know the reasons, we need to find ways to backtrack and find ways. And yes, the number one kind of support of that is the food that was given out was not compliant to the law. And it was a new thing that they wanted to make sure that they were keeping themselves pure and not defiling. So that's one of the first theories. The other one I would say is, at the time, if the king was receiving a lot of meats, there are speculations that it might have been a leftover of the sacrifices to other gods. So when the food is brought, especially meat being very rare at that time, and the reason why they are feeding these trainees meat is because that is something that is not widely available. So in that time, when you are not widely available of the meat, and when it comes from the king's table, there's a likeliness that it may have been a sacrifice to other god, and that sacrifice being shared, the overflow being shared to the trainees for them to kind of grow in their stature. So that's another speculation, another theory. The third theory might have been, and that's something where probably I think Rachel kind of touched on it. There's this thing called Nazirite vow. So in Nazirite, that there is a group of people especially in the times of Judges, and I'm going to share someone that you may all know, Samson. Samson was a Nazirite. So what was something that Samson shouldn't have done? He shouldn't have cut his hair and shouldn't have drinking wine. So that's a Nazirite vow. And at that time, it was not only for, I'm sorry. I need to track that. Nazirite vow. There's a couple of things that there would be doing. If you are not Samson, but if you are someone else, when you're doing a Nazirite vow, you actually shave your head. So that's the first thing that you do. And then for a certain time and period, a lot of times they say 40 days, they abstain from any kind of wine or any kind of meat. So that is a vow that they have. And what I did on the handout is that I put learn more of a podcast that talks about the Nazirite vow. So if you are interested, please go ahead and hear it. But this could be the idea that Daniel and his three friends came, and they had said, we're in this new nation, which was the oppressors who destroyed our temple. And what we're doing, we're going to have a vow, a Nazirite vow, not to eat from their food, but still be able to complete this 3-year training. That could have been another reason. So those are three speculations that we have. And just since Daniel never shared it or clarified it, we have to just assume that it may be out of those three. And it was really more not about what he did. It's really more about his resolve to be holy in God in the time where there was a lot of unholiness. I think that's the point of the vow. So I just want to pause here. If you have any thoughts or questions about the king's food, I'm glad to find ways for us to answer any questions. Okay. Let me just add one more thing. When I want to invite you to read it with me as well, but when I was taught about this story, somehow it always was presented as if Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego like I shared, we're actually mixing the names because Daniel is Israel name, and his Betheshar is a Babylon name, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Babylon form names instead of Hananiah, Azariah, and the Israel form name. So I'm just going to go with what I am more familiar with. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when it is presented to us, it sounds as if they were the only Jews in that training. Have you heard? I mean, does that sound familiar to you? It was presented to me as if there were all these trainees, all the kids from the royal families around the nations of where Babylon had taken control, and they were all gathered in one place. And out of those group of people, it sounded as if Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the only Jews. However, when I read the Bible, when I read Daniel chapter 1 again, and with an eyes of saying they may not have been the only Jews, there is nowhere that it specifies that it was a combination of all the other nations and young men. It really more of, if you go onto Daniel chapter 1, let me see if I can read it for you, if I can find it. It sounds more as if it was only from the Jewish people. So in verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenazar, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal families and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. So if you actually see in verse 3, it sounds like it may have been only a group of Israelites. So the point I'm trying to make is none of the other Israelites made the resolve to be like this. But something was in Daniel's heart that he had maybe convinced his 3 friends and said, we should not defile ourselves. So we need to make a resolve, which at that time may not have been necessary. But what I'm trying to say is God saw their hearts. And as a result, that's where they were excelling in every appearance, every test. And it says later down the road, their wisdom was not compared. So that's a part of King's Food and Wine. I wanted to open it up and see if there's anyone who may want to comment.
I'm amazed that out of all the people that they took Babylon, for the faith,
Nearly a year.
the rest didn't. I mean, it seems like they took 10,000 people, I believe you said. I don't know how many royal family, but there probably were a bunch.
Last time I got it, I thought it had 4 cups.
It's amazing that they had that kind of faith.
In some ways, it talks like there's a group, not just those 4 people. And in verse 8, it says, among those were some from Judah. And then it talks about testing them with their choice of what foods to eat. So
Mhm.
that leads me to believe there was more than those
Yeah.
4.
So that's a point that I'm going to go back to, that there were more than the 4.
Yeah.
Then what does that mean to us is going to be something to kind of think about. Any other thoughts before we go to the wisdom part?
Well, they were
No.
just dedicated to their faith and what they
They were
believed.
dedicated. They were dedicated. But I think it goes on to, when we're talking about the wisdom of Daniel, it goes on to how it gives us a wisdom of how to live out our faith.
Mhm.
So this is what I shared in my sermon, is it was really more focused onto that wisdom part. How Daniel present himself to the official, and let me see if I can remember his name. His name Ashpenazar. How he presented himself to Ashpenazar was the significant part. Now God did work in that. So I let me start with verse 8. So it was Daniel who first made a resolve not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he adds the chief official for permission not to defile himself in that way. So that's what verse 8 says. It starts with Daniel's initial. I am going to make a resolve, and I'm not going to defile myself. It starts with me. But once Daniel made that resolve, it was the hand of God that made it possible. So the first verse that we see of in the handout, what I put is God's hand in the negotiation. I used it as a negotiation. Verse 9, it says, now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Because, like I said, there was no reason for this official to show favor to Daniel. He's just a slave, right?
Mhm.
There's no reason. And when Daniel is actually doing something that in their eyes that could be seen as a rebellion, there's no reason that Ashpenaz should have said, hey, let's try this out. Or instead, he could have said, hey, you're not grateful enough. We're just going to boot you out. And it could have even meant death as well. Now, I'm not putting that lightly, but that's the situation that they are in. But once Daniel made that resolve, there was God's hands that moved the heart of Ashpenaz. And he was favoring Daniel, and he was trying his best to comply and find ways to meet where Daniel was requesting. And he says, you know what, I hear you, I try, but I don't know if I can do it. It's out of my hand. Once the king knows that you're doing this, I may be the one who's dying, who may be killed. So that's what he said. And then that's where Daniel comes with the wisdom, where I was trying to make a connection in the sermon, is that wisdom must have come from God as well. Where Daniel says, please test your servants for 10 days and give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink.
Perhaps God was working through him as well.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Exactly. And God was also working through the vegetables and water because, right?
I was going to say,
Go ahead.
I'm working out of my study Bible tonight, and I just read something pretty cool that I thought I would share. So in my study Bible, it actually references that it says the Lord gave Daniel favor with his captors, which was actually an answer to Solomon's prayer for the exiles back in 1 Kings. And so I went, and the prayer in 1 Kings is, and forgive your people who have sinned against you and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive.
Oh, wow.
And that they
Wow.
may have compassion on them, for they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace.
Oh my goodness.
So I don't know. I just made a connection of like the compassion that God shows us and like answers to like that they could be answers to prayers
prayer.
that were prayed for us like generations before us, and how important that is that we continue praying for the generations that come after us,
Oh
that
my goodness.
those prayers can get answered well beyond our time here on earth. I don't know. I kind of got goosebumps. Like when I read that, I'm like, oh, wow. Like there's Daniel sitting at the dinner table, you know, basically saying like, hey, can I break the law? And then
Yeah.
he's shown compassion, and it was a prayer from Solomon from, I mean, however many
Many
years
decades.
prior.
Yes,
I don't know.
exactly.
I just thought that was so cool.
That is very cool. That goes back onto how God is faithful throughout the history, how God is faithful to hear our prayers and even our mournings. And yes, like you said, Rachel, we may be here because of that prayer that was prayed a couple generations before us, and our children may benefit from that prayer of God's compassion and God's hand in their lives. So yeah, definitely this is all the hands of God, because without that hand of God, Daniel wouldn't have been able to stand out. His friends would not have been able to stand out, and they might not have been able to carry out God's purpose in the land of Babylon. So this is all the information of Daniel chapter 1. I want to invite us to think about our resolve as Christians living in this world. What is our resolve? What should we find ways to keep our faith in this world? When, I'm going to go back onto that point of when not every Jewish Israelite who were in that program made a resolve, not everyone who were captive made a resolve. It was Daniel and his 4 friends who decided and made their stance, made their mind up to make this resolve. What does that mean to us? And that's where I hope that we can kind of recap, share some of our reflections according to the information that we had heard.
May I say?
Yes, Janice.
Okay, thank you. On verse 17 of the first chapter, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams, which meant that by the time you get down into Nebuchadnezzar's problem, he has a reputation already for being able to translate people's dreams.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's the first time that I found that was referred to. And it does go along with what you're talking about, God undergirding them through the days and the meals and whatever, with learning and blah, blah, blah.
And that's what we're going to actually talk about probably next week when we talk about the dreams.
Okay.
Because, and I kind of touched on it, why in the world that Nebuchadnezzar never summoned Daniel first? He only summoned a couple of his magicians, where he may have knew that there was no one to compete with Daniel. And so that's the story that we're gonna talk about a little more. But yes, Janice, what you're saying is correct. It was God who gave that wisdom to Daniel and his friends.
But there's no in the first chapter, there's no reference to Nebuchadnezzar needing anybody except the support team he always has. He hasn't heard about Daniel's dreams, about Daniel being able to interpret dreams at this point, and for what's written here.
he did see that Daniel had the wisdom. Let me go back onto,
Right.
yes.
It says 10 times better than the others, so that's
Uh-huh.
a lot. I mean, that's not
That's
just
a lot.
little.
Right.
So on verse 19 is it, the king talked with them and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. Yes, Janice, what you're saying is right in terms of they didn't have a specific like gift. It was not on his resume that he can interpret dreams.
Yeah.
But the king noticed, and Daniel was one of those who were highly regarded in wisdom. And that's where I was saying that when he had a dream, why didn't he summon
Right.
Daniel? That's the point I'm trying to make.
Probably because he was comfortable with his own people.
His own officials and
And even though he certainly had the ability to see Daniel's capability, we kind of surround ourselves by people we need. And Daniel is still somewhat unknown, I think. So he probably went to them because he'd always gone to them.
That was their,
Daniel may have been a low level at this moment, right? Just entering into the service. So with all these information, what does this chapter mean to you? That's where I'm trying to go.
Stay true to your beliefs and trust.
Which is so hard. I mean, because to me it says don't live in fear. Because most people in that situation clearly chose to do what Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to do. Like, you eat this, okay, I'm going to eat this. Because the consequence very likely would have been death.
Mhm.
But to purposely say, I'm not going to eat that. I want this. I mean, that was brave and bold. And I think most people aren't that brave and bold. And yeah, I would put myself in that category. Like, if you're faced with death, it's so easy to just be like, okay, I'll do that, even though you know it's not right. But like, it's just a true testament to his faith that he was willing, I think, to sacrifice himself for his faith in his God. And that's a big, that's big. He was facing death in many ways, I think, by doing that.
Somehow, Lisa, this makes a connection with Queen Esther.
Mm.
So the story of Queen Esther is that, as you all know, she's in Persia, and the queen who was there did something wrong, and the king started a new quest to get a new queen, and then Mordecai was Esther's uncle, who brought Esther into this program, and similar program to what Daniel had gone through. But still, even as a queen, Esther was not able to go to the king without the king's summon. And there was a part where Haman was having this evil scheme to kill all the Jews. And Mordecai goes to Esther and says, you need to make a resolve. And I'm just paraphrasing. Esther says, this is something very hard. So I need you to do this. I need you to pray with me. I need all the nation of Israel to pray and fast with me for 3 days so I can make that resolve. So going back onto what you said, Lisa, is yes, it is hard. And when I said I did say that Daniel started this hard first, but I don't think it just came out of a vacuum. I think it came out of a long time of prayer. Actually, while you were saying, would have that been Daniel's prayer while he was traveling all the way from Jerusalem to Babylon, saying, Lord, I just really don't understand what's happening. What is going to be ahead of us? But how can I live as your child in this new land? Might have been a long journey of prayer, that come to a point where he was able to make that resolve with the help of God.
Right. I agree.
I
So,
love that you brought
yeah.
that up.
Yes. Great.
I love that you brought up Esther because I mentioned that earlier. That's one of the only Old Testament books I've ever studied, and you're right. I think her attitude was, and I think in the scriptures, if I perish, I perish. Right? I'm going to do the right thing,
Exactly.
no matter what. And I think that's really what Daniel did when he took this stand. He was just like, this is what I believe, and in probably the same thing. If I perish, I perish. And then God winds up giving him favor and compassion, and then actually at the end of it, a promotion. So I think with this chapter is what's kind of landing here for me tonight is that it's like, you know what, you show up with what God's equipped you to do, and he's gonna give you what you need. Like he's gonna do it. So it's like, stick with what you know. Don't try to blend in, right? Don't give in to the pressures that may be at the table, because whatever you need to be, whether it's favor or compassion or mercy or whatever it is that you need, God's going to meet your need, and it's going to be something even better, right? Like Daniel shows up as this low level person that's even an outsider, and then he winds up being able to interpret dreams. I think it was mentioned earlier, 10 times better.
Yep.
Yeah.
We need to do our part too, right? So when we show up, God shows up more. And as we make that connection with what Lisa had said, for us to show up, that's where we also need that prayer. We need that help from God for us to come and make that stance as well. And going back onto what we shared is that maybe not all Christians are doing it. So just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you're going to make a resolve.
Right.
But where is God calling us to make that resolve is going to be that question.
I read a lot of history, and there's
Yes.
some parallels that I've been reading in recent weeks about occupied nations in Europe under the Nazis.
Mhm.
There was some people to stand up to them in spite of the possibility of being executed. And I think there's a parallel, to me, that sounds like he had the courage to stand up for his beliefs, and it turned out okay, I guess, but that requires a lot of courage, I think.
Noah, I'm glad that you talked about it, because that was something that I was going to mention. It's more about our identity. So where I'm going to start by saying is Korea has, we have 5,000 years of history. The only time that we were not sovereign or we were under oppression was the Japanese oppression, 39 years. The first thing that Japanese did when they came to Korea was to take away our language and our names. So everyone was forced to change their names into a Japanese form name, and all the education starting from elementary to, at that time, whatever high school form that we had, were all offered in Japanese instead of Korea. And that was their way of taking away the identity.
Right.
Babylon was doing the same thing, as we know that they're using the same tactic. Daniel and his friends are all using the Babylonian names, which we can't get it out of our heads because the Babylonian names are more stuck into us. We keep on referencing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their names were all changed. And definitely their language would have been changed as well. And I think in the midst of everything surrounding us to take away our identity, I think that resolve that Daniel had with his friends was their way of saying, we're going to hold on to our identity as people of God. So using that kind of thought process, when we talk about faith versus the world, we always say it in a way that as if we need to conquer each other. I don't agree with that part. However, faith versus the world is true because the world does continuously work to take away our identity as children of Christ. And we fail. Probably that's the reason why we need grace. But it is inevitable that we are failing in that, our identity. So that's where, when that comes, that's where the resolve steps in. How can I keep my identity as a child of God in this world that's doing everything to take it away? And that would be something that leads us to seeking for a resolve.
That's a lot of pressure on a Wednesday night. But no, it's true. I mean, having the resolve, that's the hard part. It would be very easy to go along with the crowd sometimes, but
Yeah.
to be brave enough to stand true to yourself and your faith, that's where you have to be. But wow, is that hard? Even
as a pastor, I think it is hard.
Yeah.
I fail as well when I'm not in, and no, Anne and Jean, Linda, and Sophie and I, we do like a small gathering. Sometimes it works like accountability. And I have to say, when we don't have that accountability, even I, as a pastor, I slip away from my resolve. That's where I want to jump in and say, this resolve doesn't have to be something grand, something big, like, okay, we're gonna perish if we're perished.
Right.
We're not asking for that. A very small resolve can happen. But what happens is also in the accountability that sustains us and provides God's support in our lives to hold on to that resolve. I think that's the important part. So we can do baby steps.
I think that's what keeps most of us going, is that we can do baby steps, don't have to make big leaps at one time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rachel, I wanted to tell you that where we're going to go see Daniel, if you ever get a chance at Lancaster, they did the performance on Esther a couple of years ago, and it was fabulous.
I love that.
And there was a member of our church, I am told, that has several sight and sound productions, and Esther's
Right.
probably one of them. Maybe we could have a potluck dinner one night and a movie and raise money to buy commodes for the kids in preschool or whatever.
Jack and Amber have a bunch.
Yeah.
So if there's no other, let me end with this story. And I never jumped out of a plane. I never did it. Or in the Army, there's this program called Airborne. And when I was serving alongside our U.S. forces, if you had that airborne patch, you were just filled with pride, and you're filled with that sense of resolve. And one thing that I remember, in order for you to jump out of a 10,000, 20,000 foot plane, you actually have to jump out of I don't remember that tower, but it's probably around 30-foot tower. So it's not compared to that 10,000, 20,000, it is not that high, but it's a very small step. But also a lot of people feel like that tower, that small tower, is where that fear of height starts. So their entire training is jumping out of that 30-foot tree tower. And then when they're ready, they go to that 30,000, 40,000, and they jump out.
Mm.
So a lot of us, all we need to do is jump out of that 30-foot tower, small steps,
Right.
and just continue to do it. And by continuing to making that resolve and seeing God's hands of allowing us and supporting us in that resolve, not everyone will be called to jump out of a 30,000-foot plane. But when that time comes, I believe that that will be possible.